Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Renu Tyagi from Department of Anthropology, University of Delhi. Today I am going to speak on the module Behavioral Response and Adaptation to Environment from the paper Ecological Anthropology, Cultural and Biological Dimensions. The learning objective of this module are: number 1, to describe the level of stimulation and stress. Number 2, to understand the major dimensions of the sensory deprivations and overstimulation. Number 3 is to explain the problems faced in the process of adaptation. And number 4 is to find out the factors that regulate the selection during different kind of exercise. First of all, I will discuss the introduction of the module. Environment directly influences the health of an individual. This view could be traced back as far as Hippocrates. Biologists and those in the field of medicines have primarily focused themselves with the influence of physical conditions like nutrition, air pollutants, climate, etc. on health and disease, thereby following a homeostatic mode. Whereas the psychologists and psychiatrists have primarily focus themselves with the environmental stressors emerging out of interpersonal relations, occupational demands, etc. with a concept that stress is the product of conditions of personal conflict and defects in our socio-cultural institution. Let us see the level of stimulation and the stress. The individual functions within a certain range of conditions of the environment and more particularly on stimulation variables contained in the environment. This does not include only such attributes that have a direct effect on the physiological processes such as the temperature, pressure, etc., but also those attributes to which the person responds by excitation of his sensory receptor mechanism. Such environmental stressors at the behavioral level act similar to the physiological stressors. In another consequences, psychological stressors may depart from some level of stimulation in a bidirectional way, that is, in either over or under stimulation. Theoretical stimulation as proposed by Fiske and Madhi in 1961 deals with the role of attributes in the stimulus environment in activating the behavior and maintaining the arousal tone. They brought out the relationships between high activation level or intensities of stimulation and negative effect. They equated overstimulation to stress to the exclusion of understimulation and dismissed that overstimulation is irrelevant to the effect of stimulus variation on behavior. Stress is a resultant of either hyper or hypo-stimulating conditions, is similar to the sensorial stasis concept as given by the Schultz in 1965. He states that stress is a state of cortical arousal that impels the organism in a waking state to maintain an optimum level of variation in sensory functions. This concept draws to the Cannon's concept of homeostasis, which consider that increase in the stimulation beyond the optimal level disturbs the internal balance and disturbs the behavior. This further points to the Lindsay's concept of the role of reticular formation having similar effect on the sensory restriction and overload. Although Lindsay's model reinforces the idea of conceiving hyper and hypo-stimulation as comparable terms, however, there may be possibility that the behavioral manifestation may be different in the two scenarios. Now, let us see the main varieties of hypo and hyperstimulation. Hypo-stimulation is of three kinds, viz. Deprivation of the sensory stimulation, deprivation of the social interaction and deprivation of the movement. Deprivation of the sensory stimulation involves the removal of all potential sources of input of stimulus across some or all sensory modalities, mostly by placing the individual in a dark, soundproof room, preventing him or her from engaging in any stimulating activities in Hubb's laboratories. We can see the relevance of the sensory deprivation work in terms of understanding the response of the individual to circumstances such as extended stays in Antarctic or by astronauts on prolonged space flights. Now, let us see the deprivation of the social interaction, that is isolation. The stimulation that is produced by the interaction and communication with other human being is treated separate from the sensory deprivation. The distinctive feature of the social stimulus is that it provides a feedback to the individual's response and arouse an effect that inanimate stimuli would not be able to provide. Let us see the deprivation or restriction of the movement, that is confinement. Confinement is different from hypo-stimulation and is found in conjunction with the either sensory or social deprivation or both, as in case of prisoner solitary confinement. It is difficult to raise an organism under severe deprivation of sensory stimulation, for example in the dark, at the same time restricting its movement. However, at the same, it is easy to find a condition where confinement can be done up to the extent of immobilization without either sensory deprivation or social isolation. For example, confining a patient to hospital bed for an extended period of time. Hyperstimulation consists of the following two important facts. Number one is sensory overload. Sheer exposure to the stimulation has much less effect on the behavior, rather different effect than overload of information. The upper end is thus designated as the sensory overstimulation, implying that the prefix over is used in descriptive sense and to reserve the term overload to situation where the individual process information that is being carried by the stimuli impinging on them. The second point is the crowding. Crowding refers to the presence of a large number of social objects and it reflects a commonly encountered aspect of urbanization that bring in psychological stress. Effects of crowding have most recently been in the work of Calhoun. The stress potential of crowding derives less from the quality of stimulation represented by people collectively. For example, the exposure of crowd to parades. The next is the hyperdynamic conditions. An inordinate amount of physical movement marks the condition of the opposite pole of restricted movement. But it is difficult to envisage high amount of movement even though there are some specific situations characterized by high level of physical activity. Treadmill could elicit such form of restricted movement, but environmental circumstances are not readily available. Now, let us see the major dimensions of the sensory deprivation and overstimulation. Sensory deprivation can be defined as the complete absence of stimulation. But does this mean an absolute zero of the stimulation? For example, complete darkness or an unvarying homogeneous background of the stimulation, for example, unpatterned light transmitted through translucent hemispheres. This problem becomes more pronounced at the overstimulation end. We may take for granted that it is not possible to incorporate every kind of stimulation into our experiment. It is thereby necessary for us to examine the component in which the sensory deprivation overstimulation continuum is analyzed. There are 5 components. Number 1 is level. This is the only aspect that shows the variation in a large range of continuum that brought out bipolar nature of the under to overstimulation. Dimension and bring us close to the physiological mechanism on stress to body's state of equilibrium. This is shown mostly with respect to the temperature, where similar reactions are seen both at the physiological and behavioral level, such as shivering or rubbing one's hands, and from sweating to turning on the air conditioner. The second point is diversity. Both in a simultaneous and successive sense, the role of variation in stimulation have been receiving increasing interest in psychological experiments. It is reflected in Berlin's study in 1960, wherein the heterogeneity of the elements of a stimulus reflect one among many ways in which complexity is operationalized. Fiske and Maddi postulated that stimulus variation is a basic property of organism and brought in the concept of the variation seeking in explaining the different forms of exploratory activity. Yet our environment may produce the phenomena of visual pollution, for example, the gas stations, hamburger stands on the streets, etc. The third feature is patterning. Earlier, we discussed that deprivation of the visual stimulation was done through the homogeneous field of diffused light, that is, one that completely lacks the patterned information, while a diversified stimulus devoid of the structure would represent the overstimulation, that is, one that would be overtaxing the capacity of the individual to uncode and transmit the information. This principle is recognized in the aesthetic field by Mayer in 1956. For example, music. It is likely that the experience change the degree to which the individual is capable to structure the input of the stimulus, that is, to extract the information according to the type of patterning contained. One source of the stress in our environment is from the difficulty an individual faces in trying to impose the pattern on the chaotic or random constellation of stimuli confronting him, as can be seen in Lynch's work in 1960 of the urban landmark, boundaries, etc. The fourth point is stability or instability. The most critical component of the stimulus is the degree and type of movement it contains in the terms of its potential to give rise to the stress through overload of information. Two reasons for projected role of the movement in the field of complex stimulus is that, first, it is difficult to ignore a moving stimulus unlike a stationary stimulus. The other reason is that when the element of the stimulus fields are in a possible state of flux, a dynamic element is introduced into the information processing capacity in requirement for the need to identify the stimuli without extensive examination. Here we again confront the bipolar dimension in terms of its effect on a concerned individual. The fifth point is the meaningfulness. The extent to which a given stimulus taxes the individual's information processing capacity is a function directly associated with its meaningfulness to him, that is, his degree of familiarity with it and the degree of structure or organization. Now, let us understand the problem of adaptation. First, we will understand the concept of behavioral adaptation. Adaptation can be defined as a quantitative shift in the distribution of responses, that is judgmental or affective, along with a stimulus continuum, is a function of the continued exposure to the stimulus as represented by the Helson's adaptation level. His adaptation level theory. First, by defining the adaptation as a shift in responses, we may think that we are leaving the neutralization process, that is reduction of power of a given stimulus to induce response, yet in many cases this shift can be reformulated by considering the variation in response as a function of intensity of stimulation. For instance, comparing the change in response of a person to different dosage of the insecticide. Second, adaptation may be a change in behavior which has the effect of modifying the stimulus to which the person is exposed as viewed by the Sonnenfeld. For instance, an American on a visit to Great Britain during winter months may need to put on an extra sweater or an overcoat, but after a prolonged stay in England, he may no longer find it uncomfortable at the prevailing cold temperature, since his level of adaptation has shifted downwards. Let us see the changes in preference as a function of adaptation to stimuli. In a study by Haber, subjects were immersed one hand in the water at a given temperature, and then their preference for water at other temperature, both warmer and colder than the original temperature, were determined. Their preferences were found out to be a joint function of the deviation of the temperature of the sample from one to which the subject had been pre-exposed and the absolute level of the temperature. For temperature at an intermediate range, preference peak on either side of the level of adaptation produced by the temperature of exposure, a function originally put forward by the McLeod et al. In 1953. But when more extreme temperatures were used, preference functions reduced monotonically for values beyond the level of adaptation temperature. This means that no subject immersed in water that was warmer than the extreme temperature. This shows the adaptation process at work in respect to temperature. Now let us see the adaptation of effect for diverse stimulus dimensions. Helson in 1964 has postulated reference theory, which states that any given stimulus would be evaluated in terms of adaptation level formed through previous experience with the varying stimuli. For instance, a picture would be judged more beautiful if it follows the exposure to a picture independently rated as ugly at the end of the continuum than it is exposed to a picture rated as beautiful. Adaptation can be seen as the basis for the optimization functions. The optimization function is a characteristic of the preference and arousal measures in relation to the diverse dimension of stimulation which are established through the prior experience. Since adaptation levels are resultant of prior experience, they are expected to fail at same intermediate value. The most compelling evidence comes from the study of widths in 1965, where random walks of the different lengths were given, and the study of the Dorfman and McKenna's, where preference was given to the black and white patterns in fineness of the grain. These studies suggest the difference in the individual level of adaptation with respect to dimensions in questions. Now let us see the behavioral adaptation to the environment. The optimum level of the stimulation and its relation to the adaptation level, as discussed earlier, is very important for the response of individual to stimulation in the environment. Individual should be able to respond to a given stimulus in terms of level of adaptation established in prior exposure to different environments. Response to the environmental stimuli are preferred subjected to the effect of level of adaptation that predominated in the individual's past experience. We like the best what we are most used to is brought forth by the Sonnenfeld in 1967. He represented a flat terrain versus a mountainous terrain, an arid scene versus a place where water was prominent to his subjects. Mostly the preference of his subjects were in the direction of the habitat they were presently living in. One paradox to this theory is that people search for change or variation in their environment and are attracted to the unfamiliar as opposed to the familiar. Now let us understand the process of adaptation. some of the mechanisms the individual has at its disposal to add in his adaptation to an unpleasant stimulus environment is given by Miller in 1969 in his treatment of the problem of overload of information. Filtering refers to an individual's tendency to process only a portion of the input of stimulus that is affecting him and to reject the remainder. This mechanism cannot be directly applied to the loudness, temperature and the like, but it can be applied to the higher order stimulation such as density of people or stimulus that can be described in discrete order. This is vital in adaptation to conditions of sensory overload, for example, those that prevail in urban areas. It impairs the person's ability to respond to the information which may be relevant to him or her. For instance, we can say that the contributing factors for the retardation of development of the language could be due to the overdose of visual and auditory stimuli with which the culturally deprived children are subjected to, from the TV scenes to the neighbor brawling and the ever-present group of siblings. Now, let us understand the cost of adaptation. The cost to the individual to adapt to the particular environment condition to understanding of the disease has been given due importance by the biologist René Dubos. Glass et al. Has brought in the psychic cost of adaptation. He found evidences that both at the behavioral and physiological level for adaptation of individual to a situation in which the subject had to work when exposed to a burst of noise. The group exposed to the unpredictable noise posed to measures of the resistance to frustration and task of proofreading had a residual effect, and it manifested in the lower performance of proofreading and reduced tolerance of frustration. This residual effect therefore represents the price of the adaptation that has occurred, that is, whether it took place due to or despite the adaptation during the original period of exposure. Now, let us summarize what we have learned so far in this module. In summary, we can say there are attributes in our physical environment that may act as a psychological stressor which may affect the behavior and psychological health of an individual. The individual functions within a certain range of conditions of the environment and more particularly on stimulation variables contained in the environment. Psychological stressors may depart from some level of stimulation in a bidirectional way, that is in either over or under stimulation. Hypo-stimulation is of three kinds, with deprivation of the sensory stimulation, deprivation of the social interaction, and deprivation of the sensory stimulation involves the removal of all potential sources of inputs of stimulus across some or all sensory modalities, mostly by placing the individual in a dark, soundproof room, preventing him or her from engaging in any stimulating activities. The stimulation that is produced by the interaction and communication with other human beings is treated separate from sensory deprivation. Confinement is different form of hypo-stimulation and is found in conjunction with either sensory or social deprivation or both. Hyperstimulation consists of the sensory overload, crowding and hyperdynamic conditions. Sensory deprivation has 5 components with level, diversity, patterning, stability, instability and meaningfulness. The influence of a given level or kind of stimulation present in the environment on an individual derive its difficulty from the universal fact of adaptation. Some of the mechanism the individual has at its disposal to add in his adaptation to an unpleasant stimulus environment. Only by employing both physiological and behavioral variables in adaptation studies we can arrive at a healthier environment for our activities. Technology has brought in two types of changes. It has brought new kinds of environmental stressors, placing a heavy burden on the individual's ability for biological and psychological adaptation. We have been given less recognition to adaptation as a mechanism to deal with the stimulation from the environment that varies in some way from an individual's ideal and the need to change the environment to remove such stimuli and create a more satisfying one has been overtly stressed. However, Du Bois has stressed on providing a satisfying place for all human beings in relation with the humanistic values. Thank you.